And we're so glad you all could come today. Want to say a special shout out to our dear friends Joyce and Tom DeVito for the lovely spread we have back there. Yes, I was telling somebody, I used to work at the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society, and we get Cheetos and Kool-Aid. But in Boca, no. Want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events. The next town hall talk is Wednesday, December 14th. Some people pointed out the last newsletter is wrong. It's Wednesday, December 14th. And that will be about the Second Seminole War in Palm Beach County. I will be speaking along with my good friend Josh Liller, who's up there, works at the Jupiter Lighthouse. And if you're not familiar with that topic, I think you will find it fascinating that was going on here in that in the 1830s, 1840s. We also are going to have a one of our very popular concerts. It's Summer Sips and Sounds, and the next. What's the next date, Patricia? Where'd you go? Patricia's getting the camera. December 8th? No, 8th? Okay. Anyway, on our website, you can sign up on our website, and we're doing that with Festival of the Arts, and the ones we did this summer were absolutely wonderful, so you won't want to miss that.
That's holiday music.
Yes, holiday music themed, so that's going to be a lot of fun. And our next exhibit, this exhibit is 50 Years of Collecting, will come down at the end of the year. And our exhibit will be opening in January, will be about mid-century modern or MIMO architecture and also MIMO style. So a lot of us remember MIMO style. And featuring the works of Howard McCall, who was an architect who was here since the 50s. And a lot of our built environment is down to Howard McCall, so I think you'll enjoy that. Mary Zara sends her best wishes to everybody. She's sorry she could not be here tonight. She'd love to hear you, Bob, but she had a previous engagement. So I would like to introduce our speaker to you. Robert Carr, is a graduate of Florida State University. I know he has a long interest since he was a kid, right, in archaeology. And I know I grew up in South Florida too, and I had to go to Virginia to realize there was pre-Columbian people living in South Florida. But he has been an archaeologist with the State of Florida's Division of Historic Sites. He was the Miami-Dade County's first county archaeologist and was the head of the Historic Preservation Division for many years. And since 1999, he has been the full-time director of the Archaeological and Historical Conservancy that does archaeological work all over South Florida and many important sites in the Bahamas as well. Some of them I wanted to mention were earthworks at Lake Okeechobee, the Miami Circle, most of you have heard of, the Cutler Fossil Site, which is my favorite because, wow, that's really old, Everglades Tree Island, and his Bahamian projects, including the excavation of the first site of English settlement in the Bahamas, located at Preacher's Cave in Eleuthera. Fascinating. But Bob has worked in this part of the world as well, and we've asked him to speak with you tonight about the archaeology of Boca Raton. Bob.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, this is a pleasure to be here tonight, and I have to compliment this museum and the work that Sue and her staff has done. This is an incredible museum, extremely well done, one of the best I've seen. So I applaud the work that's been done here and helping create a sense of place for this community. I personally, growing up in South Florida as a kid, was very interested in history, not knowing, of course, in the beginning that I would be an archaeologist, but hoping for the best and thinking about, as a kid in middle school, which back then we called junior high, and thinking about, gee, I asked my teacher in the 7th grade, Mrs. Murphy, I raised my hand. I said, Mrs. Murphy, who were the first people in Miami? Because I knew it couldn't be all these white people and black people I saw around me. And she said, oh, they were the Seminoles. I said, oh, okay, great, the Seminoles. And I took that to the bank at the time because, you know, you believe your teachers. And so about 3 weeks later, one of my classmates, his name was Mark Green, and Mark comes up in front of the class, it's show and tell time, and he has a shoebox, and it's filled with artifacts, filled with broken pieces of pottery, this beautiful axe made out of greenstone that would have come from, as we learned later, the Appalachian Mountains. And he's showing all this, and he said, I found this here. I found this on the Miami River. And I couldn't believe it. I didn't think there was anything this old in Miami. I thought Miami had been dredged out of the bay, and Flagler was the proponent, you know. So I was so surprised. I went up to Mark after class. I said, Mark, where did you find this exactly? So he said, I can't tell you. It's a secret site. So it took 3 days worth of lunch money to convince him to take me and show me where this place was. And as it turns out, we went to what today is the Brickell Bridge. I don't know how many of you know Miami well enough, but on the west side of the bridge, it was back in the 1960s, it was a grassy lot. It was a YMCA ball field for the kids. And right in the very back of the lot, on the very edge of the river, like about 20 feet from the bank, was this mound. It was only about 3 feet high, and it was about 12 or 13 feet across. It was this tiny little mound, this bump. He said, well, look, this is where I'm finding these things. And we decided that summer that we were going to become archaeologists, not knowing any better, not realizing that we weren't doing the world any favor. Nobody was around to guide us. But we went to the library in downtown Miami, and we found out that the native people of Miami were actually called the Tequesta because there had been some archaeologists who had done work there, like John Goggin from the University of Florida, and then a local avocational archaeologist named Dan Laxton. And we started reading the Florida Anthropologists. We started learning something about what the archaeology was like, and so we were very excited. We got trowels, and we went to the mound, and we were very disciplined because we decided, we knew that the secret of this mound was right in the middle. But we said, you know, we're not going to start there. We're not going to do that. We're going to go from the edge, and we're going to work our way in carefully. We took notes. I did the drawings. He took the notes. And we started working our way towards the mound. And we had a little screen. We were sifting, and we were finding all kinds of animal bones and different kinds of artifacts. So we were excited. Every day, our parents were happy to hear about what we found that day. And as we approached August and slowly working our way, and you can imagine how hot it was, but when you're a kid, you don't even notice that. You know, you sweat freely. You don't have anything bad about sweating. You know, that's just the way it is. And it's August. I know it's about 2 weeks before school is going to start again. So finally, we're at the middle of the mound. We finally did it. We're really excited. And we've got our trowels, we got our brushes, and as we start scraping our trowel into the middle of the mound, we hear a sound we had not heard before. It was a sound of the screeching of metal. We knew we were metal against metal. And as we started brushing away, we started uncovering this piece of iron. And it got bigger and bigger, and eventually we found we had uncovered a Model T Ford. And so what we learned was the mound was there because they had been cleaning up the river and had dredged out this car and put it up there with all the dirt, with all the artifacts. So in the end, we hadn't done any damage. So creating that circle of sorts is that in the last several years, we're working on a site, again in Miami, very close to the Miami Circle. As it turns out, that property that I had seen as a kid, at 13 years old, became the site of Size River Gate, as well as the U.S. Customs House. And the Customs House was built in 1972 or 3 while I was in college, and came back and everything was gone. And you think, wow, the city's changing, everything's disappeared. You start to think, wow, all the things have been lost as a result of new development. And they had to do a demolition of the building, in the city of Miami, because of the work I had done with some of the other preservationists, we actually passed the first ordinance in the history of the United States on a municipal and county level that protected archaeological sites. So anybody building near the Miami River actually had to do an archaeological study. So I was retained to work with the developer to do a due diligence as to what might happen. And I said, well, what might happen is when you tear the building down, it is possible, just like the Miami Circle, that you're going to find something under this building. So give us time to do the assessment, and we'll tell you exactly what you're going to get into. Instead, what they did was we did the demolition, and we were out there monitoring, and we started finding artifacts. And unfortunately for them, we started finding Native American human remains. Well, that stopped the project. And interestingly enough, as I was telling Sue earlier, the developer, that window they gave us to do this study was exactly 7 days long. And they already had scheduled the construction equipment coming in 7 days, had pre-sold almost half of their apartments. They were in a bad place. And now, but we gave them good advice. They just, money talks, and that's what drives things. And we are still excavating 1.5 years later. It is the largest archaeological project in the history of South Florida, with over 100 archaeologists working, probably the largest, one of the largest in the history of the United States. And although I can't tell you all of the things we're finding, I can tell you some of it is remarkable and will really change our knowledge and ideas about Native Americans in South Florida. And we can talk more about that. But today I wanted to focus on the archaeology of Boca Raton. I got to see where I'm at on this. So Boca Raton, in selecting this area, you can see these labeled areas are all the specific archaeological sites, at least some of the sites that are known in the Boca Raton area. And of course, what is most obvious is how intensely developed this part of Southeast Florida is. And no surprise, I mean, the beach area, the coastal island, you see so many of the sites are right there on the island, are all located. By the way, just so you know, PB stands for Palm Beach, and the number is the number in order of historic or archaeological sites that have been identified and put into a master database in Tallahassee with the Florida Division of Historic Resources. So keep in mind that these are the known sites. What we don't know are all the sites that are gone. Dozens and dozens of sites have already disappeared and been destroyed. And as I'm learning, that even the sites that appear to have been destroyed may actually exist below some of these buildings, some of these homes, and that's something worth keeping in mind. So in talking about the opportunities of preservation of archaeological sites, which you can imagine in South Florida is a rare opportunity. Ancient America, located near US 1, is no longer Ancient America, and I know that the museum here has a pretty good, you have a good amount of information and photos that they've shared with me. But what's really interesting about this place is that it was, I believe, it is the first archaeological site to be set aside for a park as an archaeological park in Florida. I believe it's the first one. I'm not talking about possible state parks, but this guy, E.G. Barnhill, who was a big advocate of archaeology and of Native Americans and frankly also a treasure hunter and loved artifacts and relics, he was the one who actually knew about this mound, decided to buy, I believe, 40 acres on the east side of US 1, and he, starting in 1953. And E.G. Barnhill had this idea that if he could preserve this burial mound, which was about 15 feet high, that people would come to it. And what would make it interesting is that he had archaeologists from the University of Florida, Ripley Bullen, come down and actually do excavations through the mound like a tunnel a cross-section of a trench, and there it was filled with human remains. Now, back then, there was no regard or respect, as there would be today, about preserving and avoiding disturbing these back. At that time, human remains were fair game as part of the archaeological objectives. That's changed quite a bit in recent years. And here's a shot of the mound in 1958. And what happened was, once Bullen was finished, and there was a publication about it, he turned that trench into a tunnel. He put a roof over it so you could walk through. So it was an interesting idea. It didn't work. He didn't have a lot of attendance, as it turned out. This is what it looks like today. It's part of the land after he abandoned the property. It was sold for condos, but they had to preserve the mound. Now, I'd like to give you the personal touch with these things. So I want to tell you a little bit in my thirst for knowledge and interest with Mark Green. My mother, I was with my mother, was a single mom working hard out of Philadelphia, never learned how to drive. So I was pretty much housebound in Miami, except for the generosity of my friends. And so again, my friend Mark finds out about ancient America, and he said, we got to go up there and see this place. It's an archaeological site. So he convinces his father to drive us up there one day, and this is 1961. So when you go to the website, it says that ancient America was abandoned in 1958, but that's not true, because in 1961, it was there, and we were there, and Barnhill was there. So when we drove in, we were the only people. So I could see maybe things were not going financially well for him. And he was a really interesting guy. He saw us, these two kids, that we were motivated and interested. He gave us this personal tour with his personal interpretation, that not only was it this amazing burial mound with this Indian village further to the east towards the intercoastal, but that it was also the landing place with a Spanish mission. It was this amazingly elaborate story. But we were spellbound by this, because now we were seeing this for the first hand. And we were disappointed to see that the human remains that had been in there had all collapsed. All the sand was collapsing because he hadn't figured out a way to stabilize the sand. He had glass siding, but everything had fallen. So it was an experiment that failed. Well, keeping that in mind in terms of his good intentions, at least he certainly was interested, I eventually became the Dade County archaeologist and working in Miami. And at that time, I was working for the National Park Service before I had that position. I had graduated from Florida State University, and working at the National Park Service, it turns out their office was also at Florida State, and they recruited a lot of students, and I was fortunate enough to be one of those students. I've been working with them in Big Cypress and in the Everglades for 2 years. It was a great project for a young person, and we were going out finding archaeological sites by helicopter, and we would land, and we had all kinds of misadventures and things, so that would be another lecture. But when the project was over, my director, my boss, Pete Faust, said, I've got really good news for you. He said, I'm going to send you, there's a position opening at Cumberland Gap in Tennessee. It's a 2-year contract as an archaeologist there, and we're offering that to you. And I said, wow, that's great. I was really excited. But the next day, by this odd coincidence, I get this contacted from a historic preservation director from Miami, and he said, we just got a grant. We're going to do an archaeological study in Miami. We want to know if you'd be interested. And I said, oh my God, but it's 1 year contract. And it was a lot less money than what the national parks. But I wrestled over it for a day or two, and I said, I'm going to go to Miami. That's where my heart is. So I told Pete Faust this story, and he goes, what, are you nuts? He said, you're going to not go to the Cumberland Gap? You're going to go to Miami, to that place? Are you kidding me? I said, yeah, I'm going to do that. So I did. And everything went really well. I thought it was interesting. I got to look for every site east of the Everglades and try to inventory them and assess them, coming up with ways to protect them and document them. And when I started there, nobody even knew what the name DeQuesta meant, other than some town north of Jupiter. They didn't know. They called it DeQuesta, of course. And my mission was to, in part, was to not only help preserve some of those sites, but to give people a sense of, not just a sense of place, but a sense of consciousness of the depth of the history here, that this was a place with a tremendous prehistory. And so that was part of what I was doing over the years. And one day in 1987, I told you it would be a lot of stories. 1987, I go to the Coconut Grove Dinner Key Auditorium, which once a month would have an antique show, and I'd love to go to the antique show and find all these things. And here's this book dealer, and he's got this table, all these antiquarian books, but what I see is they're all books on Florida, Florida archaeology, Florida history. They go back to the 1800s. I'm amazed. I've never seen so many of these books in one place, this particular book dealer. And I open up the end paper, the cover, and I see E.J. Barnhill's name written on every one of the books. I go, where did you get these? He said, well, I got these from the Barnhill estate. He died. And, you know, they're selling them. They have this huge garage sale going on. I said, really? I said, where? He said, well, I'm not going to tell you. I said, come on. So I never got any of those books. Well, I think I bought a few from the book dealer. But I made it my business. I had to go to the phone books to find out that he lived in, where was it, in Boynton Beach or something? Do you remember? Yeah.
I think he's buried here.
Maybe it was in Boca. So I found the address, and I go up there on a Saturday, and sure enough, the garage sales, the estate sale really is what it was. It had been going on for at least 6 or 8 weeks. And his widow greets me at the door with a friend of mine who's a contractor. And she said, well, I'm sorry. She says, I've sold everything. There isn't anything left, but you're welcome to come inside and see where we lived. I said, sure. And here are the bookshelves, and they're completely empty. They're totally empty. And I'm thinking, gee, I can't believe this. And on one of the shelves, I see a piece of paper that's stuck underneath the edge of the bookshelf. And I pull it out, and it's a map of Boca Raton. And there on the map, he has notations of all the archaeological sites that he had found. And this is something I'm going to pass on to you, by the way. Yeah. So I'm really excited. I said, well, this is where, and she said, oh, well, if that's that important to you, just take that. That's fine. And then my friend, who's an antique dealer, he's looking around. He's equally depressed, but he'd been going there, so he'd already found a lot of things. So he was part of the reason I went there. And very astute observer. He opens up a closet in the hallway, and keep in mind, he's a contractor that does drywall. And he says, look at this closet. He says, isn't that strange? I said, yeah, it looks like it's too small for where the wall is. He says, yeah, and he turns to the widow, and he goes, do you mind if I break a hole in this? He said, I do drywall, I'll fix it. He said, I have a feeling there's something here. You've never heard these stories before, never been advertised. So she doesn't want to do that because she's got the house for sale. But he just keeps working on her, and he finally convinces her to do it. I'm not there because it's the next week, and he goes back and he does it. He calls me up, and he's hysterical. He goes, you've got to come over to my house. You've got to come over now. He won't tell me what it is. I go to the house. In the middle of his floor of his living room is a treasure chest, a real treasure chest from the 1600s. And it's made in Germany, and it's filled with this beautiful German ironwork of a lion. And I'm saying, wow, what? He said, it was behind the wall. I go, are you kidding? That's incredible. He says, but that's not all. And he opens it up, and it's filled with Spanish coins. Hundreds and hundreds. And he takes the chest, and he dumps it onto the floor, like out of a movie, and all the coins go across the floor. He said, because you helped me, take out any 10 of these coins, and they're yours. He says, consider it your finder's fee. I said, you know, I know a lot about coins. I'm going to pick the 10 best coins. He said, I don't care. Just take them. And he did. And I said, but one other thing. I know these coins are worth a lot of money. And he paid her for them, by the way. He gave her, I think, $1,500. I'm sure that's not even nearly as much as what he got. But I said, you know, that chest is really important. I want you to allow me to get that into a museum. And well, he did. So it's currently in the History Miami Museum, this chest. I don't see it on display, but I know hopefully it's still in their collection somewhere. So I wanted to share that, how life takes these twists and turns and things that are important seem to come to pass. And with all of my personal nostalgia, I will move on to the first people here. Wait a minute. So talking about archaeological preservation, here we are. We have some sites in Boca, such as the Gumbo Limbo Park, that has just incredible midden sites. And we're doing Ocean Strand, a newly created park. It's that area that you see outlined in red. And we hear rumors that there's an archaeological site there. And you've heard that too, didn't you? But for whatever reason, the state didn't have a site file form for it. So we do the assessment to see what's there, because the city's going to turn this into a park. And wisely, they want to know if there's an archaeological site there, how do they do their management plan? How do they develop the park? And going back in time, 1947, you can see there were some disturbances in there with roadways, and there was a single house. So the place wasn't completely immaculate, but other than that impact from early development, not a lot had happened there. This is the map of our test holes, and the test holes that are red were positive prehistoric materials, and that means artifacts such as pottery or shell tools, as well as animal bone and shell refuse. And we create these maps. We map everything very carefully, because finding things in context is an important part of interpreting archaeological sites. Looking at one of the views of the park, this is part of the midden. And this kind of site, by the way, is called the Black Earth Shell Midden. And this is all evidence of habitation that was part of prehistoric subsistence. The site goes back at least 1,000 years. And we do a density map showing where the densest quantity of material is, and you can see in the red and the darker colors is where the main part of the site is located. And then we create an outline, excuse me, of the site. And then we meet with excuse me, with the park managers and the people who are going to be involved in clearing and developing a part of the property, so they know where the boundaries are, and we set the lines. And they go in there and they do the clearing by hand. They don't use heavy equipment. Yeah, go ahead.
Is this near La Fontana buildings or Gumbo Limbo down that way?
The park, Gumbo Limbo Park, I believe it's to the south, I think.
North of it.
Or north, yeah, maybe like a half mile to the north.
Close, I got it.
So there's the piece of prehistoric pottery that we found there. This pottery is a type that it would be roughly 1,000 years old. But to give you an idea of what you find in these sites, these are typical bone artifacts. Keep in mind that the materials that most people think about when you think of Native Americans, you think about arrowheads, you think about those kind of things. Those are not common in South Florida, because there is no chert, there's no flint, there's no hard stone. It's all limestone. And so the people are so adaptable, and they are very resilient in dealing with their environment. So just taking pieces of bone and sharpening it and putting it on shafts was sufficient for use as darts and arrow points. Shells, commonly as part of the food refuse, also could be used as picks, as hammers, as scrapers, and effectively even creating like ladles and holders and cups. Fishing was such an important part of subsistence in Southeast Florida, Boca Raton in particular, that these are typical. There's just the expedient reality of just picking up stones off the beach. Some of them already have natural holes in it, but often just using those as weights for nets and for fishing. These are a little in the middle, a little more sophisticated. This is a plummet made out of shell, and there's a lot of debate amongst archaeologists what these plummets were used for. Some archaeologists believe that they were used as fishing lures or fishing lines, but I would suggest to you that considering the amount of work involved in making one of these, I think it would not be a great idea to be using it as a fishing weight because you're going to lose it very easily. Many archaeologists think that they are deliberate ornaments, perhaps having ceremonial value.
What about textile?
What's that?
Textile.
That's right. And that's one of the really good theories, that they're weights for textiles or even for net like making.
I'm referring to my masterpiece.
That's good. That's actually part of, I'm writing an article right now, and that's one of the items that I discuss in there. More shell tools on the top right, that's called a celt. It's actually an axe. And we've done experiments. These shell celts are made from the lip of conch shells, and you can actually cut a tree. They were using them for woodwork and making canoes. Typical material that comes from a site, pottery, lots of animal bone, which allows us to reconstruct the environment in terms of the species and the kind of habitat that might have been exploited by native people. Now, what I haven't talked about, and just showing you the material things, is what is the real story. So the Native Americans, the first people of the Boca Raton area, at least from the time of Spanish contact, were called the Jegua. Now, it's spelled with a J, and a lot of people say Jaguar, but you got to remember it's Spanish, so they're phonetically writing what they're hearing, and the J sound is a Jegua sound. And the Jegua, apparently, Boca Raton Inlet is a boundary between the DeQuesta Native Americans to the south and the people to the north were the Jegua. And that line was a very important line. I'm not saying that it was precisely at the inlet, but more or less on the inlet, probably going all the way up to Jupiter Inlet. And the Jegua were essentially a canoe culture in the sense that if they couldn't get there by canoe, they probably didn't go. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't do plenty of walking, but it was basically getting around by water. They were so adept with the marine resources and the resources of the interior and the Everglades that traveling between the barrier islands and going into the Everglades on the various creeks and using the Spanish River were something that was just part of daily existence. And when the Europeans arrived, when the Spanish arrived, and we don't have a lot of archival data about the Jegua in terms of the Spanish descriptions, because most of the Spanish descriptions in South Florida on the East Coast deal with the village of DeQuesta at the mouth of the Miami River, where they attempted Spanish missions and fortifications. And there you have a lot of descriptions of the ceremonies and so forth. But I would imagine that the descriptions for the DeQuesta are not so different than it would be for the Jegua. And with that said, what's fascinating with the DeQuesta studies is that when the Spanish first arrived in Miami in 1567 in terms of attempting to create a settlement, a fort and a church with Pedro Menendez, who 2 years earlier had founded St. Augustine, is they, of course, believe the DeQuesta and all the Native Americans in Florida are heathens, they're savages. Why? Because they don't practice agriculture. I mean, what's wrong with it? They tried to give them corn, tried to get them to do that. They weren't interested. What they didn't understand was that Native Americans in South Florida had an advantage that other Native Americans didn't have, and that is that the maritime resources were so plentiful that they didn't have a reason to have to use agriculture and expend that energy. And only South Florida and the Pacific Northwest are the two areas of the continental United States that actually had prehistoric societies that became very complex and stratified with a chieftain at the top and shamans in various different levels, Pacific Northwest and in South Florida, because of the plentifulness of the marine resources. And like the Pacific Northwest, we know that the native people of South Florida were also harvesting whales, monk seal, which became extinct in the early 20th century. Anything and everything you could imagine that lived in South Florida was on the palette for native people. Now, what's actually interesting is not so much what they were eating, but what they weren't eating and what you don't find. And one of the things you don't find a lot of are certain birds, hawks, eagles, owls. They on occasion, but extremely rare. Now you might argue, well, I mean, who's going to eat a bird? There's hardly any meat on it, right? But I would submit that the major reason was that these were sacred animals. And when you were as a native person, you didn't have a distinction between natural and supernatural. There was a continuum because they believed life and death were deeply connected and committed to one another. And one Spanish priest notes in dealing with the Diquesta, he said that the Diquesta believed that they have 3 souls. One soul is in the eye, another soul is the shadow, like Peter Pan, and the third soul is the reflection in the water. That's really important because that sense of spiritual cosmology in terms of that connection to not only what the soul is, but where it could be in the future, actually is a clue as to why many of the Native American sites in Florida, in terms of the cemeteries, are actually occurring in wetland ponds, because the water is the barrier, is the portal to the next world. So you're looking at your reflection. Now you can understand why they would put the body underwater, because that's where the soul is, and they're uniting the soul with the physical body. Now this is in the early mid-archaic period, but these wetland-type patterns continue right up through the Glades period, where you find evidence of human remains that are put around the tree islands in the Everglades. As well now, we're finding them near the banks of the Miami River. Scattered human remains and what they would call, archaeologists would refer to as secondary burials. Secondary burials being that they would put the body out to naturally desiccate, being taken apart by crabs, by the buzzards. Is one reason you don't need a buzzard, because obviously these are the guardians of the other world. They're taking the soul or some part away. And once that is complete, the bones would be collected and then put into the ground, either in a natural solution hole or buried in a beach dune. And you would find that the large bones and the cranium might be there, but what would be missing would be all the small bones and the digitals, the metatarsals and the metacarpals. So finding secondary burials is very, very common during archaeological excavations of midden sites all through South Florida, as we've learned in different places. So the idea of this cosmology, I think, is really important for us to understand why Native people felt so connected, and why when you went hunting or fishing, you would do an offering, you would give thanks, you would say a prayer before you would kill the deer, and you would actually take a part of the deer, a piece of the meat, and you would bury it as an offering for the success of the hunt. And we would find in some of the sites, particularly in Palm Beach Island all the way down to Miami, you would find pieces of sharks, articulated pieces of sharks, buried a foot below the ground. And we know they're intentional, because if you take a fish or anything and you just throw it on the ground because it's scrap, it doesn't stay articulated. It just comes apart and it just gets scattered. So we know these things are being done intentionally. So here you have these Native people who are profoundly connected to their world, and for the Europeans who first find them, and of course, as they'll tell you, many Seminoles today, we didn't need to be discovered. We already knew we were here. So it didn't take long after Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513, and that's another really interesting story. And by the way, he didn't land in St. Augustine. Evidence is that it's probably closer to Cape Canaveral, and he made stops along the way going through South Florida. We don't know exactly where he stopped. He refers to inlet or river or cross, which some people think is Jupiter Inlet, others think it could be St. Lucie Inlet. And we know he got to Miami, Vizcaino, or he refers to the Tequesta as the Chiquesta. And the reason we know a little bit, because his journals, his logs have all disappeared, is because the historian Herrera in the 1540s had access to his logs and wrote a history of the West Indies and Florida and cites these things. So we know that native people were encountering Europeans certainly as early as 1513, and frankly earlier, probably 1505, when some of the first slave raids of gathering these people up as slaves to take them to plantations in Cuba and Hispaniola was going on. As a result of these encounters, under Columbus, his estate, his corporate entity granted to him by the Spanish king and queen, he depopulated the Bahamas between 1492 and 1515. There was no Lucayan Indians left. They were all, if not taken in slavery, they began to die in large numbers as a result of contact with European diseases, which they had no immunity. Frankly, it is really the American Holocaust. Millions of people died in a short period of time in the Americas because of this contact. And the aftermath of those people who survived, many times they were a result of mixing between Europeans and Native Americans, so they had more immunities. The last of the South Florida Indians, and by the way, going back to when the first Spanish arrived, particularly before 1567, was, if you were a European, if you were a Spaniard, I would say your life expectancy in South Florida, landing on a ship or in a shipwreck, would be about 3 to 4 minutes. Most Europeans, most castaways were killed, are taken as slaves, with few exceptions, with children, interestingly enough, some children and some women. And one of those young men was a man named Escalante de Fontaneda, who in circa 1543 was shipwrecked probably in the Keys somewhere with his brother, and everyone in the ship apparently was killed except for him. And he describes that the reason they didn't kill him was that the cacique, that is the chief of the Calusa, which is, by the way, was the dominant tribe, and the Calusa were on the west coast of Florida, that the cacique was actually asking the Spaniards that they had just brought ashore to their camp to entertain them, sing and dance. We'd like you to see you sing and dance, And of course, the Spanish didn't know what they were saying, but somehow Fontaneda kind of intuited what might have been meant, and he started singing and dancing. Well, the other Europeans were killed for being insolent, except for him. And he became basically an Indian. And he grew up, he learned the Indian languages, he still could speak Spanish, and he was part of the people. And it wasn't until Pedro Menendez arrived in the 1560s that he was discovered and liberated, and he wrote his account. It's a really fascinating account of what he observed in terms of the names of the villages and some of the customs and so forth. So the web of history and prehistory is so extensive. There's so many places you can go with it, and there's so much to learn that I think it's important for all of us to not lose sight of who these first people are and how much they have lost and suffered as a result of our being here and replacing. I don't personally feel guilty in the sense, because I didn't do anything, at least not in this lifetime. Maybe there's reincarnation, but the fact is, I think we have a responsibility to at least be aware of these things that have happened and try to make things balanced and working. And as part of that, doing that through archaeology, I've also written a few books. One of them is called Digging Miami, if you're really interested. It's University of Florida Press. Another book is a Arcadia book, and a kind of a terrible example of capitalism here. Having these books here on the Everglades, what's interesting and why it was fun to do was that it's a pictorial history of the Everglades, but I try to make the reader understand the Everglades, the historic Everglades, actually is 5 times larger than Everglades National Park. And this is a book that documents the early history, including a little bit of the prehistory and the Native Americans that were here. And finally, I would say that I just finished a novel. It's called The Python Conspiracy, which I'm hoping will be published next year. And it is the story of the Miami Circle that I can't tell in a scientific paper. And it is fantasy, it is fiction, but it has a lot of things that are really accurate as to what really happened. So with that stopping point, I will ask if you have any questions or anything you might want to add. Yes, go ahead.
So when you had Barnhill, when I came here in '77, I heard shortly after that they were trying to build some houses on the intercoastal, but they had uncovered skeletal remains of Indians. So that was local rumor.
Okay, yeah, I was not familiar with that discovery. When's,
On in Highland Beach,
oh, yeah.
sites.
Oh, is that what he's talking about?
Maybe.
Oh, okay, Highland Beach, I
Highland
didn't.
Beach, and they actually did the excavations,
Yeah, Highland Beach is, there are, you know, Highland Beach has an amazing, what's left of a burial mound as well as a midden. That there's a building right on top of it, but still a lot of it is preserved on either side and on the front of it. So have you seen it?
Where?
Well, I don't remember the address. It's on the east side of the road. Yeah, I just don't.
Address a little bit about when the Aboriginal inhabitants were gone from here
Yeah.
versus the Seminole.
Sure, I can. We talked about how the DeKalb and the Hagwa and all of Native Americans encountered the Spanish and what the consequences of that. So what is interesting in how things flip-flop and alliances one day are enemies another is that that hostile relation between the Calus and the DeKalb and the Hagwa with the Spanish changed after about 50 or 60 years, and the way they became a little more enamored, if you want to say, is the Spanish were smart enough to bring trade goods. The trade goods started to capture a little more cooperation, to the point that by the 17th century, the Native Americans of South Florida were actually allies with the Spanish. And this is what the Spanish wanted. They wanted this allied relationship because they wanted a bulwark. They wanted to stop the raids of the English and the ambitions of the English who were coming down from Georgia and the Carolinas, attempting to take Florida as an English colony. So the Indians were a major defense for keeping that happen. And things got very bad in the very early 1700s. In 1709, there was a major slave raid launched by a tribe called the Yamasee. The Yamasee were in northern Georgia and South Carolina, and they were doing this slave raid on behalf of the English because the English needed help, labor, slaves for their indigo and rice plantations. So they would give, I don't know how much they were paying, but they were paying a set amount of money for each Indian that would be brought by the Yamasee. So the Yamasee actually made their way down to South Florida, all through Palm Beach, all along the coast, and started killing and capturing as many people as they can, bringing them up by the hundreds to South Carolina and Georgia, where eventually they all died, again, for some of the same reasons. Eventually, in a very short amount of time, the Yamasee actually became angry with the English, and they went to war, and it was called the Yamasee Wars against the English. And the Yamasee actually found their way into Florida, ironically, and began settling here. And by 1763, which is the date of the second attempt of a mission, actually 1743, the second mission at the mouth of the Miami River, by this time, there's only 300 Native people left in South Florida, because between 1709 and 1763, thousands of Native Americans from South Florida and other parts of Florida actually kept going southward because of these raids from the Creeks and the English, eventually getting to Key West and actually petition the governor of Cuba to pick them up and take them to Cuba. So it's like, wow, what a change of events. In a couple hundred years, things have really changed. And so they were lined up in the quays, and when the governor sent ships to pick them up, he found out somebody was giving him some kind of misinformation because a lot of them would not get on the ships. They weren't too interested, but many did. Many of them did actually go to Cuba. And the way the Spanish dealt with the indigenous people was very, very different than the way the English dealt with them and the way the Americans dealt with them. The Americans, when they took over Florida in 1819, did not have the compassion that the Spanish had, even if it was a strategic economic relation. And the English were very shrewd. They created a lot of alliances. They were in charge of Florida between 1763 to 1783. And then in those 20 years, they set up all these major trading posts. So they, again, had a very solid alliance with these tribes. When the Americans took over, the mission was clear. Let's get these people out of here. They're occupying good land. We can put people here. We can have farms. And, first they confined the so-called Seminoles to the central part of the peninsula, away from the coast, so they couldn't get guns or anything from the Spanish. And then eventually decided that with the Treaty of Moultrie Creek that they were going to send these people on essentially what is the Trail of Tears. So a very different mentality, which is the inception, as you will hear in the next talk, of the Second Seminole War. It's really fascinating. But going back to the Tequesta and the Hagua, the last of the people, native people of South Florida, indigenous people, are gone by the year 1763. Most of them taken to Cuba. Now, there's probably some stragglers, some who came back on their own, some who really never went and just slipped into the Everglades. And again, I'm going to give you a great personal account. It's not too personal, but as the idea that there could be Tequesta or Hagua or Calusas still living in Florida in the 20th century, I thought it was a fascinating idea. And Sue, have you ever heard this before? So I found in the Miami News an article from the 1920s about a hunting party for the northerners who came down and were taken into the Everglades. And they stumbled into these people who were not Seminole. And they apparently had a Seminole guide. And they said that these were primitive Indians, and they had this incredible encounter. It's like a really interesting story. And you never know in the 20s whether these stories are real or not, because you never know. And I always thought about that. So I worked as a consultant for the Seminole tribe for 10 years. And I took that opportunity to talk to a lot of the Seminoles and some of the Miccosukes, particularly the older ones and the traditional ones. And I asked them, I said, have you ever heard of the idea that there were Calusa and Tequesta here when you arrived? And by the way, most of the Seminoles arrived about 1830s. There were some earlier, but mostly in the 1830s. And I said, oh yeah, we have stories of that. He said, yeah, well, James Billy, who was the head of the Seminoles, the chairman for many years, he said, oh yeah, my uncle, my great uncle encountered some of these people, and they stabbed him with a spear. And he's just matter-of-factly telling me this story. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And that would have been like in the 1930s, by the way. And then I ran into a guy named, trying to think of John Fritchie. John Fritchie is associated with that site in Miramar that we were talking about on the dairy. And John Fritchie was a guy who grew up in South Florida on a truck farm with his father, going from truck farm to truck farm. And he was a smart kid, but he never got past the 8th grade, and he was only in school intermittently. And John Fritchie, in his 70s, came to my office in Miami. And on that particular day that he came by, there was another, one of my assistants was there, Bill Steele, who was an eminent Seminole War historian. And he said, this old guy came in and he had a Publix bag, a paper bag, and he said he had a lot of things he wanted to show us. But he said, I looked in the bag and it was just scraps of paper. And he kind of dismissed him. I said, well, it might be something important. I mean, did you get his number? And he said, no, I didn't get that. Well, fortunately, John Fritchie came back a couple months later with his Publix bag. And he dumps it out on the table, and he spreads it, and he says, well, and he was a cracker. He said, well, these are all my notes. I've been writing things since everything I can remember about what I've seen, because he was really interested in archaeology. And he heard about what we were doing because we were doing work at Joe Robbie's stadium when they were building the stadium where an archaeological site was located. And he told me, you know, right next to the stadium is a major Indian site in what turns out to be Miramar across the county line. And he said, and we farmed that place in the 1930s, me and my dad. He said, I'd like to show you what I found there and show you the site. I didn't know anything about the place. And it was on the Perry farm, the Perry Dairy. And we got permission from the family, who was still there at that time. And they let us go on there, and sure enough, there was this big rise, this island. This essentially was an island on the western edge, or the eastern edge of the Everglades. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. And he walks up there, and he goes, oh, somebody moved that rock. That wasn't there the last time. And I go, well, when were you here? He goes, well, 1930s. I said, okay. So he had this eidetic memory. He had a memory for visual things. It was extraordinary. And he just walked us around, and he showed us all these different things that he had seen and found. And we went through his notes, and we were amazed. They were filled with these interesting details. And eventually, our conservancy published his book called the Everglades Journal, which has his memories as well as his theories about acid rain. It's really interesting. I should give you some of those if you're interested. And bring this up because one of his stories was when he was a boy in Collier County on one of the sluways, they were farming near, I can't remember the road number, but he took me there and showed me where it was. They were farming away, and he said the waterway came right by their farmstead, and all of a sudden there's a canoe that appears, and he would see the Seminoles all the time, and he went out to wave at them, and the father grabbed him and pulled him, and he said, don't wave at them. He says, those aren't Seminoles. And he looked and he said, wow, they didn't have any clothes on. And he said those were the Seminoles called them the moon-eyed people. That's how they referred to them, the moon-eyed people. And I always remember that story. And going back to what I told you earlier in the 1920s, so the hunting party, when they shot a deer, and when they got to the deer, they found one of these primitive Indians over the deer, gutting it with a primitive knife. And when they showed up, he just took off running. So I share all these stories with you because there's always a seed of truth to at least some of what you hear and what you learn. It's always worth listening to people. And one of the things I always remember with my sense of history and how we're all part of this continuation is that as, again, a young guy, I was about 19 years old, go down to the Florida Keys to visit some friends of mine in Sugarloaf Key. And there's this old guy, an old guy is anybody older than you. And his name was Knox Julian. He was an attorney and a lobbyist from Washington, D.C. And he had become filthy rich because he had been the advocate for nullifying the tax on 5-cent chocolate, or Hershey's chocolate, or any candy bar in Wrigley's gum. They were going to put a 1-cent tax, which is 20%. And he was able to lead the defeat of the tax. And because of that, he was richly rewarded by these two companies. So he ended up buying all this land in the Keys. And when I'm meeting the guy, he tells me, he says, I know you're interested in archaeology. He said, but I'm going to shake your hand. And he takes my hand, he shakes it. He said, now I want you to know, you just shook hands with a man who shook hands with the man when I was a boy who sat on the lap of George Washington. So with that said, and all my storytelling, does anybody have any other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Quick question. Is there any studies or any idea of how many Native Americans were here in Florida or in South Florida before pre-European?
There's been speculations, and I can tell you none of it is really grounded on hard data. Some people have said like 20,000 people in southern Florida. I kind of doubt that. I know it's in the many thousands at the peak of whatever that population would have been. But the problem is you can't just look at a site and look at the size of it, because even on a large site, people would shift and move around. And when they did that, they would they might be moving simply because it smells bad because of all the rotting oysters. So they just go to the other part. It's not so easy to come up with a population.
I had
Yes.
heard that in the whole state of Florida, there may have been as many as 100,000 or even 500,000.
Right, and I would just say it's possible. I mean, if the carrying capacity of Florida was 100,000 or 500,000, that would, yeah, it's very possible, I suppose. You know, I don't know, and I don't know what that scientific solution is to ever figuring that out. Well, with that said, I really appreciate this time and then being able to share with you. Thank you so much.